The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the savanna in shades of amber and crimson. In the midst of the golden plains, a man named Ryan trudged through the wilderness. He was an experienced wildlife photographer who had ventured into this untamed land to capture its raw beauty. Armed with his camera, he was no stranger to the harsh realities of nature but still held a profound respect for its creatures. After hours of exploring, he found himself far from his intended route. The dense thicket and the eerie silence of the encroaching night were unnerving, yet Ryan's curiosity outweighed his caution. Setting up his camp near a small watering hole, he planned to photograph nocturnal wildlife that often gathered there. As night fell, the savanna came alive with distant roars, howls, and the rustling of leaves. Ryan sat patiently, his lens focused on the water. Suddenly, a faint sound caught his attention, a high-pitched cry, almost like a baby's wail. He turned his camera toward the source and saw something unexpected. A tiny lion cub, limping and whimpering, its golden fur glinting in the moonlight. The cub seemed to be no older than a few weeks, its oversized paws stumbling as it attempted to walk. Its distress was evident, and Ryan instinctively lowered his camera, his heart aching for the helpless creature. He scanned the area, expecting to see the mother lion, but there was no sign of her. The cub appeared to be alone. Ryan hesitated. Interfering with nature was against every principle he believed in as a wildlife observer. Yet something about the cub's vulnerable state tugged at him. Could it survive the night without its mother? Before he could decide, a distant roar echoed through the air, a lioness. Ryan's pulse quickened as he realized the cub's cries might attract predators. The cub stumbled closer to him, its small, trusting eyes meeting his. Ryan's resolve faltered. He couldn't leave it there to face certain death. Moving cautiously, he wrapped his jacket around the cub and brought it into his makeshift camp. The cub trembled but did not resist, its cries softening as it nestled into the warmth of the fabric. As Ryan tended to the cub, offering it water from a bottle cap, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. The savanna's night felt heavier, more threatening. His instincts screamed danger, but he couldn't abandon the cub now. He named it Simba, a nod to its lineage and a silent promise to protect it at least until dawn. The night passed uneasily. Ryan heard distant growls and the occasional snap of twigs. He stayed awake, his senses heightened, clutching a flare gun for safety. Simba slept peacefully, oblivious to the dangers surrounding them. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Ryan felt a flicker of relief. He decided to move the cub to a safer location, perhaps closer to a pride that might adopt it. But as he prepared to leave, he froze. In the distance, a pair of glowing amber eyes stared back at him through the brush. The lioness. Ryan's heart pounded. Was she here for her cub or to protect her territory? He realized too late that by intervening, he had inadvertently placed himself in the crosshairs of nature's law. To be continued? The lioness stepped out of the thicket, her powerful form illuminated by the soft morning light. Her eyes, blazing with intensity, locked onto Ryan. There was no mistaking her purpose. She was here for the cub. Simba stirred in Ryan's arms, letting out a small, plaintive cry. The sound pierced the stillness and seemed to ignite a spark of recognition in the lioness. She paused, her ears twitching toward the cub, but her gaze never left Ryan. Ryan's mind raced. He knew enough about lions to understand the peril he was in. A lioness protecting her young was among the most dangerous encounters in the wild. Slowly, he set Simba down on the ground, careful not to make any sudden movements. "Easy now," he whispered as much to himself as to the lioness. Simba, still unsteady on its legs, wobbled toward the lioness. For a brief moment, Ryan thought the ordeal might end peacefully. But then the wind shifted, carrying Ryan's scent to her. She let out a guttural growl, her body lowering into an aggressive stance. Ryan instinctively stepped back, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. He hoped she would recognize that he meant no harm, but the lioness advanced, her movements slow and deliberate, her growl growing louder. The primal fear of being prey surged through Ryan. He glanced around, searching for anything that might help him escape. His flare gun was within reach, but he hesitated. Using it might scare her off, but it could also provoke her further. Simba, oblivious to the tension, stopped midway between Ryan and the lioness. The cub looked back at Ryan, then up at its mother as if torn between the two. The lioness took another step forward, her growl deepening into a roar that echoed across the savanna. Ryan's survival instincts kicked in. He grabbed the flare gun, pointing it toward the sky. With a sharp crack, the flare shot upward, its fiery trail cutting through the dawn. The lioness flinched, her roar turning into a snarl as she leaped backward. For a moment, Ryan thought he'd bought himself enough time to retreat, but the lioness quickly recovered, her eyes burning with even greater fury. Ryan's heart sank. The flare had startled her but hadn't deterred her. He knew he couldn't outrun her, and climbing a tree was a futile option in this terrain. Simba suddenly mewed again, louder this time, and the lioness froze. Her eyes darted to the cub, and something shifted in her demeanor. She let out a softer growl, a sound of acknowledgement, and crouched low to the ground. Simba toddled toward her, its small body trembling but determined. When the cub finally reached her, the lioness nuzzled it, her earlier aggression melting into maternal relief. Ryan exhaled, his muscles trembling with the tension he had held for too long. He took a cautious step backward, hoping to slip away unnoticed. But as his foot crunched against dry grass, the lioness snapped her gaze back to him. Her protective instincts flared again and she let out a warning snarl. Ryan froze, his mind grappling with his next move. He had done what he could for the cub, but now his presence was an unwelcome threat. As the lioness nudged Simba away from him, Ryan realized he might not leave this encounter unscathed. To be continued? The lioness growled low, her sharp amber eyes boring into Ryan. Simba clung to her side now, but her protective instincts hadn't waned. Ryan knew the rules of the wild. Proximity to her cub marked him as a threat. Every step he took backward felt like a gamble. The savannah seemed to hold its breath. The sun's golden rays bathed the landscape, but the warmth did little to ease Ryan's cold dread. He tightened his grip on the flare gun, aware that he had only one shot left. The lioness wasn't attacking, yet, but her stance spoke volumes. Ryan considered his options. Running would trigger her chase reflex. Standing still wasn't working either. A voice in his head screamed at him to climb something, anything, but the sparse terrain offered no sanctuary. The lioness began circling him, her steps deliberate, her growl rumbling like distant thunder. Simba followed her movements clumsily, watching Ryan with wide, curious eyes. "I didn't mean any harm," Ryan murmured, his voice trembling. He doubted the words meant anything to the lioness, but speaking them eased his own fear. In a flash, the lioness lunged forward, her massive body covering the distance between them in seconds. Ryan's instincts kicked in, and he fired the flare gun into the ground at her feet. The burst of light and heat stopped her mid-pounce. She recoiled, snarling, and backed away. But the flare's brief brilliance had cost Ryan his last defense. He was now utterly exposed. The lioness wasn't retreating, she was recalibrating, her growl rising again. Ryan's breath came in short gasps as he edged backward, his mind racing for an escape route. But before he could act, the situation took an unexpected turn. A sudden cacophony of growls and roars erupted from behind Ryan. He whipped around to see a pack of hyenas emerging from the brush, their eyes gleaming with malice. Drawn by the commotion, they had come looking for an opportunity to scavenge. The lioness immediately turned her attention to the hyenas, her stance shifting from offensive to defensive. She positioned herself between the pack and her cub, her powerful roars echoing across the plain. The hyenas hesitated but didn't back down. They knew they outnumbered her. Ryan's fear took a new shape. He wasn't just trapped between predators, he was now part of a volatile battle for survival. The hyenas began circling, their high-pitched laughs cutting through the tense air. The lioness snarled, lunging at one that ventured too close. Her movements were calculated but strained. Fighting off a pack while protecting her cub was a near impossible task. Simba crouched low, trembling against his mother's side. Ryan's heart twisted at the sight. He couldn't stand by and watch the cub die after he had fought to save it. Against every instinct, he stepped forward, shouting and waving his arms to distract the hyenas. "Hey! Over here," he yelled, his voice cracking. The pack's attention shifted to Ryan. For a fleeting moment, he felt the full weight of their gaze, hungry, calculating, and ruthless. The lioness seemed to understand his intent. With a guttural roar, she pounced on one of the hyenas, her powerful jaws clamping down on its neck. The pack scattered briefly, startled by her ferocity, but Ryan knew it wouldn't last. A hyena broke from the group and charged at Simba, its yellowed teeth bared. Without thinking, Ryan grabbed a nearby branch and swung it with all his might. The impact sent the hyena sprawling, but the effort left Ryan vulnerable. The pack regrouped, their focus split between the lioness and the defenseless human who dared to challenge them. To be continued? Ryan's chest heaved as he faced the pack, the broken branch trembling in his hands. The hyenas circled him now, their laughter echoing like a sinister chant. Behind him, the lioness fought fiercely, her roars punctuated by the yelps of hyenas that dared to get too close. Simba crouched low behind his mother, shivering with fear. Ryan's mind raced, every instinct screaming at him to run, but he knew he wouldn't make it far. If he fled, the hyenas would overwhelm him, and the cub might not survive without his help. A hyena lunged at him, its jaws snapping inches from his leg. Ryan swung the branch, hitting it squarely on the snout. The hyena yelped and retreated, but another quickly replaced it, snarling as it advanced. The pack was testing him, probing his defenses. Ryan glanced over his shoulder and saw the lioness holding her ground, blood staining her golden fur. She had taken down 2 hyenas, but the strain was evident in her movements. Ryan made a decision. If they were going to survive, he and the lioness needed to work together, even if she didn't fully trust him. He shouted, loud and forceful, trying to draw some of the hyenas away from her. "Come on. Over here." His voice cracked, but it had the desired effect. 3 of the hyenas turned their attention to him, their gleaming eyes narrowing as they closed in. Ryan swung his branch again, this time aiming to keep them at bay rather than attack. The hyenas hesitated, their movements cautious, but their patience was running out. Behind him, the lioness roared, pouncing on another hyena that had gotten too close to Simba. Ryan seized the opportunity to reposition himself, moving closer to her. They were stronger together, even if their alliance was born of desperation. As another hyena lunged, Ryan sidestepped and struck it with the branch, sending it sprawling into the dirt. The pack was growing more agitated, their chaotic laughter rising in pitch. But then, a sound pierced the air that silenced even the hyenas, a deep, resonant roar powerful enough to shake the ground. Ryan froze, his heart pounding. From the distant brush emerged a massive male lion, its golden mane shimmering in the sunlight. The king of the savannah had arrived. The hyenas immediately scattered, their bravado evaporating as the lion strode toward them with deliberate, commanding steps. One by one they slinked back into the shadows, their laughter fading into the distance. Ryan's knees nearly buckled with relief, but the danger wasn't over. The male lion's amber eyes locked onto him, and Ryan realized he was now in a different kind of peril. The lioness turned toward the male, letting out a low growl that seemed to communicate something Ryan couldn't understand. The male lion paused, his gaze shifting to the cub. Simba let out a tiny cry and toddled toward him, nuzzling his massive paw. The tension in the air shifted. The male lion's posture relaxed and he stepped back, his attention now fully on the cub and lioness. Ryan, however, knew better than to linger. Slowly he backed away, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. The lioness watched him, her amber eyes unreadable. She didn't growl, didn't lunge, she simply stared. When Ryan was far enough, he turned and ran, his legs shaky but determined. He didn't stop until he was sure he was out of their territory. As he collapsed against a tree, catching his breath, he looked back toward the savannah. He had survived. And though he might never know if the lions understood his intentions, he hoped that, in some way, they recognized his sacrifice. To be continued? Ryan leaned against the sturdy acacia tree, his breaths ragged and shallow. The encounter had drained every ounce of his strength, but he was alive and so was Simba. As the savannah stretched out before him, bathed in the golden hues of the rising sun, he couldn't help but feel a strange connection to the lions he had just left behind. For a moment he considered returning to his camp, packing up and leaving this wilderness for good. But something in him resisted. Simba's fragile cries and the lioness's fierce determination replayed in his mind. They were more than just wild animals to him now, they were symbols of the untamed beauty and raw emotion that the savannah held. As he rested, Ryan's ears caught the faint rustle of movement. He tensed, instinctively reaching for his camera bag, where he kept a small utility knife. The sound grew closer and then, emerging cautiously from the tall grass, was Simba. Ryan's heart sank and soared at the same time. The tiny cub had followed him, its wide eyes filled with a mixture of fear and curiosity. "Simba," Ryan whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "What are you doing here?" The cub mewed softly, its tail twitching as it approached him. Behind Simba, the lioness appeared, her powerful frame moving with the grace of a predator but the restraint of a guardian. She stood several feet away, her amber eyes fixed on Ryan. For a moment, neither human nor animal moved. Ryan's mind raced with questions. Why had they followed him? Was the lioness still perceiving him as a threat, or was there something else at play? Simba reached Ryan's feet and nuzzled against his leg, its tiny purr vibrating through his boots. Ryan hesitated but then crouched down, his movements slow and deliberate. He extended his hand, letting Simba sniff his fingers before gently stroking the cub's soft fur. The lioness didn't react aggressively. Instead, she watched intently, her gaze shifting between her cub and the man who had risked his life to protect them. Ryan stood slowly, unsure of what to do next. He couldn't keep the cub, it belonged to the wild. Yet something in the lioness's posture suggested she wasn't here to attack. Her body language was relaxed, almost grateful. The lioness took a step forward, her powerful muscles rippling under her tawny coat. Ryan froze, his pulse racing. Simba scampered back to her side, nudging her leg. To Ryan's astonishment, the lioness let out a soft, almost plaintive sound. A low rumble that was neither a growl nor a roar. It was a sound of acknowledgement. She nudged Simba toward him one last time, as if encouraging the cub to say a proper goodbye. Ryan's throat tightened. He crouched again, letting Simba climb onto his lap for a moment. The cub's tiny paws batted at his shirt, its playful nature shining through despite the ordeal. As the moment stretched on, the lioness stepped back, her gaze lingering on Ryan before she turned and began walking away. Simba followed her, but not before looking back at Ryan one last time, letting out a small, mournful cry. Ryan stayed rooted in place, watching them disappear into the horizon. He felt a strange mix of sadness and fulfillment. He had survived, but more than that, he had earned a fleeting trust from one of nature's fiercest creatures. The savannah returned to its usual hum, but Ryan knew he would never see it the same way again. To be continued? Days turned into weeks, but Ryan couldn't shake the memory of his encounter with Simba and the lioness. Back at camp, he meticulously documented every detail, pouring his thoughts into his journal and capturing the savannah's beauty through his camera lens. He often found himself looking toward the distant horizon, wondering about the cub. Had Simba grown stronger? Was the lioness able to keep her cub safe? These questions lingered in his mind, but he knew the answers were beyond his reach. One morning, Ryan stood on a rocky outcrop, scanning the plains with his binoculars. He had ventured back to the area where the encounter had taken place, hoping to spot the lioness and her cub. The savannah was teeming with life, gazelles grazing, zebras trotting in herds, and the occasional shadow of a predator slinking through the tall grass. And then he saw them. The lioness stood proudly on a distant hill, her golden coat glistening in the sunlight. Beside her was Simba, no longer the fragile cub Ryan had saved but a confident young lion. His movements were steady, his playful energy now tempered with the beginnings of maturity. Ryan's heart swelled with relief and pride. Simba had survived, and the lioness had done what nature intended, raised her cub against the odds. But what happened next took Ryan completely by surprise. The lioness turned her head, her sharp eyes scanning the horizon until they seemed to lock onto him. For a brief moment, man and beast regarded each other across the vast expanse. Then she did something extraordinary. She let out a low, resonant roar, not of warning or aggression, but something gentler. It was a sound Ryan couldn't quite interpret, but he felt its weight. It wasn't gratitude in the human sense, but it carried a meaning that transcended language. Simba mimicked his mother, letting out a playful growl before nuzzling against her side. The two lions stood together for a moment longer before turning and disappearing into the grasslands, leaving Ryan with a profound sense of connection. As the savannah returned to its serene rhythm, Ryan sat down on the outcrop, letting the moment sink in. He realized something fundamental had changed within him. He had come to the wilderness as an observer, someone fascinated by its raw beauty but detached from its reality. Now he felt like a part of it, tied to its rhythm and its creatures. That evening, Ryan returned to his camp and began preparing to leave. But before he packed his last bag, he placed a small wooden carving of a lion on the windowsill of his tent, a token he had bought from a local craftsman before his journey. It would remain there, a symbol of the bond he had forged with the wild and the life he had saved. Months later, Ryan's story made waves in the wildlife conservation community. His photographs and journal entries, filled with vivid descriptions of his encounter, inspired a movement to protect the region's endangered lions. People were captivated by the tale of a man who had risked everything for a cub that wasn't his to save. For Ryan, the accolades didn't matter. What mattered was the legacy Simba and his mother represented, the resilience of the wild and the delicate balance between human and nature. As he left the savannah for the final time, Ryan turned back one last time, the horizon glowing with the warm hues of sunset. He smiled, knowing that somewhere out there, Simba was growing into the king he was destined to be. This concludes the story. Let me know if you'd like to refine it further or adapt it into another format.